Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart, the High Elf Realms for Warhammer the Old World and Well are truly on the way and available to pre-order at the moment. And Games Workshop kindly sent me a Ishaya Vess to take a look at. So let's get it built and painted. Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems and offer custom items to suit your club, your event or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description. Just before we get started, if you haven't already caught them, you can watch my review of the Arcane Journal, my painting video and unboxing of the new Illyrian Reavers and the same for the Lord of Thrace as well. So let's have a look inside the packet. So this is Forge World resin, not to be confused with Finecast back in the day. This is not the kind of stuff that is. This is high quality resin, a new formulation in the last couple of years, I believe, and they go together very well. Usually there's instructions inside. The red areas on the instructions show where you might have to remove some flash, yellow where you have to fit the parts together and add glue. They can be brittle in places, so you need to be careful. I trim off the little vents here using my clippers as usual. I tend to go to the small ones first. If you go for the big ones, they can snap parts if they are delicate. Be very, very careful. Take your time. Sometimes you might need to saw a little bit away, but usually for infantry models like this, that's not the case, but do take your time. You can also file away as normal as well, and again, just take your time, be gentle to start with. They're not quite as robust as plastic for those small detailed areas. Super glue is essential, but they tend to go together pretty easy, and before you know it, you have your miniature finished. Where to look out for it now is on those extremities when you're painting. Occasionally you can damage a part, and if anything is out of shape at all, a bit of hot water or a hairdryer will normally fix it. So there she is, all primed and ready to go. Now I've raised her up slightly on an extra little rock there just to give her a little bit more height, because she's going to be the general of a small force that I'm working on. If you've caught my other High Elf tutorials recently, you'll have seen this combination. This is Gravestone Blue from Two Thin Coats and then Model Air White. And what I'm doing here is with the airbrush, I'm trying to build a solid white basis for the miniature. There's so much white on the miniature and I want to make a really nice smooth white. And if you're able to do so with an airbrush, this really saves loads of time. So it's a very thin coat almost all over the miniature of the grey, but I do focus top down and I'm trying to leave a lot of that black showing in the recesses to really enhance the shadows when I paint later on. Then after that, it's the white also through the airbrush. I'm focusing much more top down here, trying to keep those shadows in the recesses and that grey blue in the recesses as well. I do go in for the sides a little bit, but really trying to lean into that shadow as I keep saying. Where I know it's going to be pure white, I allow the white to be a little bit heavier as well. I'm trying to build a bit of transition in there, and it saves so much time later on, though it does mean you need to be careful when you're painting not to get paint where you don't want it. For the final stage of preparation painting, so to speak, even though we've covered the white there, I'm using a little bit of white star, but any white will do, your favourite kind of white, and I'm dry brushing on. I'm using a dry brush from Knott's Hobbies here and their dry brush palette. There's a link in the video description with 10% off if you are interested, but any of the softer style rounder dry brushes I believe are best for this. I got very little paint on my brush at all. I'm just brushing it over the detail so that when I glaze over the top that really pops through. What I don't want to do is add any streaking, so I'm being super careful. You may also notice I was holding on to the edge of the spear with my finger at one point, again just to protect the slightly more brittle resin when you're doing things like dry brushing. And there she is. Much fur is very grayscale. It doesn't really show very well at this stage because the light and the camera just sort of blow out that white a little bit too much to make it really easy to see. But the white is also very smooth and there is a good transition there. And the next stage is actually to finish that white, or nearly finish that white. You can come back a little bit later and we do right at the end. But I'm using this Pilar Glazier here, and it's a really light blue, almost just like a glaze. And I'm just adding this into the recesses where that grey is showing through, and then feathering it out slightly. And it really just kind of boosts that white, makes it look like a nice transition between a bluey grey through to the top stages of white. So I'm taking my time putting it into the recesses. It doesn't matter if I get it anywhere that's going to be metallic, because I'm going to be covering that over, but the rest of it I'm trying to keep it just where I want to. The good thing is it's such a mild pigment, light paint, that you've got quite a lot of play with it, and you actually need to build it up layer by layer. Now moving on to Contrast Flesh Tearers Red, and then Sanguine Scarlet and Demon Red from the Two Thin Coats range. And I use a lot of Two Thin Coats, and you can find a really useful conversion chart on the Transatlantic Game website right over to Citadel, very, very close matches. And there's not an awful lot of red on this miniature. There's a bit of a sash, and there's a little bit down the front, what I'm choosing to paint red anyway. It just adds a little bit more interest, along with the whites and the blues and the green tones. It really adds a little bit of a spot colour, really. So using that Flesh Tearers Red, because it's really, really rich and almost royal and velvety, and then highlighting up with those other two paints afterwards, almost using them a little bit of a triad. Then we have Talassar Blue, Contrast, and Amarth Blue and Hyrule Blue from the Scale 75 Fantasy Games ranges. Again, you'll have seen all these colours if you followed my other recent High Elf tutorials. So I'm using the Talassar Blue as the base for all of the blue on the little miniature project I'm working at the moment. And in her case, there's lots of trim around the edge of her sort of flowing clothes and robes that go around that scale plate and around the other areas. Some miniatures have it on the sash and things like that as well. Now, I'm trying to be careful here not to get it on much of the white areas on this miniature. We spent quite a lot of time with the airbrush making sure it's nice and smooth, and that is one of the drawbacks of doing that white early on. I do need to be extra careful, but the payoff at the end is worth it. And this Talassar Blue goes over beautifully anyway, and if you're painting rank and file, you can get away without doing too much highlighting on. And I'm really only doing very subtle highlights on this blue here anyway, layering up with the mid-tone and then that top highlight of the Hyrule Blue, mixing them together a little bit as well at times, and I'm just focusing on the edges, just the lighter areas where the light hits the most. A nice simple flesh recipe using mostly contrast paints here. So we've got Guilliman Flesh, Shage Purple and Vulpus Pink, finishing off with some Elven Skin from the Two Thin Coats range afterwards. And I start by applying the Guilliman Flesh neatly over all of the flesh areas, as you'd expect. Enough to flow into the recesses, so you've got a nice shadow there, but not so much that it kind of leaves any tide marks on any of the raised areas. So you've got a really nice built-in highlight, as the paint was designed, I suppose, in the first place. Then once we've done that, we go in with the purple colour, and I'm just shading here, usually around where the flesh meets the armour or the clothing or the hairline, or in this case her patch as well. So a very, very thin line round, and it just adds that little bit of extra depth and a really nice distinction between the flesh colour and then the next stage or the next part of the miniature. Then after that, I thin the warmer colour, so in this case the Vulpus Pink, 50-50 with water on my wet palette, and glaze it over the lower part of the face, mostly around the nose, but the cheeks and the lips and things as well. It really lifts the colour, adds some warmth to it, and you get a nice variation between the flat Guilliman Flesh, the darker, cooler purple tones, and then the red tone from the Vulpus Pink. At this stage, I usually do my eyes. If I do make any mistakes, I can fix them before I do that final highlight on the flesh, which would be really annoying to have to go back and fix when you're finished and happy with it. But after that, I'm using the Elven Skin, thinned a little bit on my wet palette, just to highlight the areas that stand out the most. So across the top of the nose, usually across the cheekbones, that kind of thing, knuckles on fingers. If you need to, you can add a little bit of white to put a little dot right on the end of the nose, or right across the cheekbone or across the brow of the eye, and just work on it slightly just to bring it back up after you've applied all those layers of glazes, and it just tidies it all up and looks really great. And it's pretty simple. For the hair, I wanted to dirty up the blonde just slightly, so I'm mixing Skeleton Horde and Iron Jaws yellow on the wet palette, touch of water just to help it flow. And it's still pretty bright and vibrant, but it just gives it a slightly more earthier tone. And again, I'm trying to give a really nice even coat so it flows into those recesses enough, but leaves it pretty smooth over all those raised areas. So you get the real effect of that contrast paint without it looking too muddy and streaky and dirty. And for the highlight, I'm mixing White Star and Iron Jaws contrast again on the wet palette. It's thinned enough by the Iron Jaws contrast paint, so it's a really nice consistency to work with. You can see here I'm just using the edge of my brush so I can pick out some of those raised strands, not all the way along the strand of hair, just enough to really catch where that light would hit. As we build up the highlight, I'm just adding a little bit more white just to really make it pop and stand out right at the center where that hair's raised the most, and then towards the end of the strands of hair as well, almost being pure white, just to make it look like the light's really catching. So more contrast. This is a Kellen green. It's a lovely mixture of blue and green, a really sea-based feel to it, so it's perfect. I'm using this for all of the detail that's embossed on the shield here. Now I think the studio scheme has this in red. I wanted to go different. I think I've even got red on my Seaguard unit, but as a character I wanted the shield to stand out as something a little bit more special. We've already got red on the miniature on her sash at the front anyway, and this just flows really nicely over all that detail. I'm taking my time here because I want white on that shield as well, and we've already painted that as I've mentioned earlier, so I'm really trying to make sure that it doesn't run too far, or if at all, if I can help it, off this sort of raised detail area. I'm also using the same colour just on an area of detail over her left shoulder pad, and then also the bottom of her side clothing across her armour. There's this lovely waves detail, and it's the same that's on the bottom of some of the shields of the Seaguard, and I painted that in the same way back a couple of weeks ago in my Seaguard tutorial. Now we have Cursed Blue and Ray Gun Glow, and they're just the perfect colours to highlight up this Kellen green really. So working with the Cursed Blue straight away, this is all thinned and on my wet palette, just focusing where the contrast green actually looks the lightest. You can use it as a guide to colour in, so to speak. So I'm just making those areas a bit more focused and pop and stand out, and then I start mixing in that lighter green blue as well, 50-50 at first and then almost pure at the end, and slowly building it up, trying to keep it as neat as possible and just make it really stand out and pop as a design on that shield. Exactly the same in those other areas of that shoulder pad, same method, same colours, layering up, building towards that lighter colour at the end. Now we have Cygor Brown, cuirass leather, boarhide and fur cloaks. We're using Cygor Brown as the contrast base layer, which I do with so much of this miniature, and that's for all of the leather areas here. Now some of the rest of the army I've been using a slightly lighter tan effect, but this is a special character and I wanted her to stand out a little bit more, and rather than having black on her eye patch and a tan on her boots or all these different mixes, I wanted all the leather to match as if she's paid for it to be made especially for her. And I think I just love this richer, darker colour that highlights up towards a nice sort of rich reddish brown as well. So we're doing her boots, the little strands around the back of her hair, so her leather hair tie, of course her patch as well, and there's a couple of other little tiny areas around the strapping. Then after that is very much standard layering, highlighting, working with all three paints on the wet palette at the same time, so I can blend them together or go back to a darker shade if I go a bit too much, and I'm just building up those colours, that boar hide first, which is almost the same colour as the Cygor Brown, just slightly lighter, building that up, leaving loads of that Cygor Brown showing, and then straight afterwards going in with the next layer and the next layer, leaving the paints fairly thin on the palette so that you can build them up slowly so that you don't have those really thick brush strokes in there, and as they dry they tend to blend back together quite nicely, these paints as well. You see it just slowly building it from that really dark rich brown to the slightly redder effect of where the light is hitting on that nice expensive leather in this case. The silver armour I'm using Coat Silver and Mithril Blade. Now a couple of my tutorials actually used another silver in the middle of this, but after painting all of these miniatures I've realised that middle stage just doesn't really show up. These are both relatively light silvers anyway, so one's a kind of a mid-tone and one's a highlight, and part of the reason for doing that is I want the silver to look nice and bright. I don't want it to look too grim and dirty. These high elves have got a nice clean look to them overall in terms of a palette, and this works quite nicely. So she's got all the scale armour around the side, she's got some metal forearm greaves, if that's the word, as well, and then there's obviously the metal on the edge of her trident as well. And once that base layer is down, it's just working through some highlights. So in the case of this scale mail at the side, it's going along unfortunately and working on each individual piece of mail. There's not too many. They stand out really well, so you're just working along really and doing little dots on them all. It's much quicker when you get to the ends of the blades and things like that. The golds we have Viking Gold, Dwarven Gold and Elven Gold, all from Scale 75's Metal and Alchemy range. And I really do love these. It's slightly warmer gold than some of the mixers I use, and I'm starting with that Viking Gold. As you can see, it's almost got some warm orange tones to it, and that works really well with all these really cold colours. So even her hair is fairly warm in its undertones. Got browns, we've got brown leather that helps lift the warmth a little bit, but the rest of it's all whites and blues. So the mix between the two in terms of an overall palette works really well. I'm just going around and picking out all of the gold now as a first layer. So you've got the trimming around the edge of her shield, you've got all the remaining metallics on this trident, even a little edging around the bit of cloth that runs down the front of her legs as well. At this stage, I'm definitely being very careful. So many parts of the miniature are finished. I don't want to get the metallic paint on them. And the metallics are a little bit harder to quickly clean up as well, because as soon as you add a bit of water to them, those metal particles run everywhere and stain all the bits you finish, which can be really annoying. So I am taking my time here, but it'll be worth it in the end. And we are getting quite close to finishing now. Now we're starting to work our way through those highlights with that base layer down. So next up we have that Dwarven Gold, which is the first lift in colour. And the reason I've not skipped straight to the highlight here, the Elven Gold's a little bit colder, and I wanted to keep that warmth and maintain that warmth in there. And this really, really helps. So you're lifting that base colour, covering probably 80% of what you've already painted, and it really starts to lift it, and it's a nice shiny warm gold as a result. By the time we get around to that final highlight of the Elven Gold, you're really just putting it where the light is catching, just to really make it pop and stand out. And I think it's very subtle, but it really, really works as a nice final finishing touch. I'm using Spirit Stone Red here for all of the gems, just to speed them up, and even for the characters, and I just think it looks really, really nice. I've added a little bit of silver on areas that were covered by gold first to really make it pop and stand out, because they just show through. And then it's a little bit of wash on the metallics, and I'm using a ready mixed oil wash called Grease from Scale 75, which is my go-to at the moment. If you are using standard washes, make sure you use a sepia tone and try to be really careful and just keep it in those recesses. Otherwise you're going to have to go back and repaint some of those metal areas that you want to be really nice and shiny, because it will dun them down. The difference with this oil paint is it will run into those recesses. Pin washes are a little bit easier, and then you can clean it up off any areas you don't want it afterwards, and they work a little bit different. Do give them a go if you've not tried oil washes before. Just use an old brush with them. Once those oil washes are dry, you can use some artist thinner or fast dry thinner like this AK1 here. Not the stuff you get from your hardware store, it's too strong. But use some of this stuff on the same brush, just a little bit, have a paper towel to the side, and you can just go back any areas where the oil paints have got that you don't want them, you can just clean them away. And you can do this as soon as they are surface dry. You can blast them with a hairdryer, you can wait 24 hours, 48 hours, and they will still wipe off again with the thinner. They're so good, and it will leave them in the recesses, which shades nicely and tints nicely, but you can really clean this up, and I think it's great for that. Now this is the bit, it's very much optional, but I think maybe it's something you want to do with your characters at the least, is to go back with white at the end and just really make that white pop. So it's thinned on my wet palette. I'm using White Star from Two Thin Coats, and I'm going back and really accentuating a few edge highlights here and there really on the white that we built up with the airbrush. So in many ways it's just going around the edge, the harder edges of the flowing clothes, occasionally where it's kind of most raised in the middle, just to doing a little bit of a tidy up or to really enhance that white to make it really stand out. On the flowing cloak areas like this, it's pretty much done with you for the airbrush. There's also little bits like this you couldn't do with the airbrush, so picking out the edges of those little waves, you could leave that if you don't want to, or just paint them completely in a green colour, but I think it's a really nice effect to make it stand out by putting a nice little neat line around the edge. Other parts of the miniature you might want to do it is around the clothing on the shoulders or the elbows, that kind of thing. You can really just focus on a few lines where the folds of the clothing stick out, but I think it really tidies it up and really makes it pop for that final finish. So I've finished off the basing, I'm adding a black rim to finish it off, and there we have a finished miniature. But let's go and have a look at some proper pictures. Now, this was the last of the new miniatures that Games Workshop sent me that I've got around to painting. I did the Illyrian Reaver first, which took me the longest, probably that'll be because of the horse. And this, it was potentially my favourite out of them all, though I really enjoyed painting the Lord of Thrace. It was quite simple and straightforward. This was a little bit more fiddly, but I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought. I was a little bit concerned about the pose and whether it will be really hard to do. And I love this miniature a lot more now I've painted it. She's definitely going to be the general of a small project that I'm working on. More about that in a month or so, I think. It'll be a fun little smaller project compared to some of my other ones, but it will still be something fun for those of you that follow the channel and like to see my boards and things that I make to go with them. There will be a small display board focused on this sort of high elf theme as well, which would be cool. So she will be leading that, will be a big part of that, and I will talk about that more in the future. But if any of you order this miniature, obviously by the time this video is coming out, they will have been on pre-order for a while. She may have even sold out by then, I don't know. I'm recording this prior to the launch of it all, but let me know if you've ordered her, what you think of all of the new miniatures. Let me know what you think of the launch overall, because I'll be really interested to know what people think. And like I said at the start of the video, if you haven't checked out all of the other videos I've done recently for High Elves, there's quite a lot to do with the new launch. I also painted a sea guard, also painted a bolt thrower as well, so there's quite a lot of content tutorial wise, including the review of the Arcane Journal as well, to delve into. So if this is your first video you found of mine around the High Elves, do go and check those other recent videos as well, and all of the other Old World content. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you Games Workshop for sending me the miniatures ahead of time. If you have enjoyed the video, please do drop a comment below, like the video, subscribe, and all of that stuff. Check out the video description as well for all of my links and affiliates, including the channel sponsor, which is Counter Attack Bases. If you really want to support me, check out my Patreon as well, because it's really the best way of supporting me and helping me continue to make these videos. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.